All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending the Board of Directors meeting for Windsong Ranch. Today is November 29th, 2022, and I've got right at 6 o'clock, so I'll ask the board to call this meeting to order. Thank you. So we have just a couple of housekeeping items. To my right on the table over here are the handouts for tonight's meeting. You'll have the financial reports. There's also the proposed budget over there on the table along with today's agenda. We've also done something a little different today, is that there's a QR code on one of the handouts there. So if you'd like to snap that with your phone, then it'll load the PDF for you so you'll have the materials. Okay, let's get started. Now that we have come to order, we will establish quorum following along our agenda, and that will be done here by the introduction of your directors seated to my left, starting with David Blom, the president of the association, Craig Martin, vice president, and Tina Sauceda, secretary treasurer. So with quorum established, we're going to continue on, and I'll start with the presentation. Today's topics, we are going to start with a recap of 2022 and a financial review as of October 31st, which we're going to go through this a little quick, not to do it any injustice, but we just did a review of the September financial reports at our most recent meeting. So a lot of this is going to be somewhat of an overview from where we were at that point. But as we continue on, we will also prepare the income and expense reports, and which surmises the budget. And we'll do this in two parts. The first will be for Windsong Ranch. We'll do the financial review and present the budget. And then I'll turn things over to Giovanna Jones. Giovanna is our operations director, and she will do the presentations for the villas here shortly. And then, of course, we will ask for a vote from the board to adopt the proposed budget. So continuing on with the presentation, we're going to dive right into the financial review and start with the revenue. So the revenue, as we can see here on the screen, is a bit short from our projections. At this point in the year, we were looking to be somewhere around $6.5 million, about $6.4 million, and we're at $5,113,252.71. So that is it's about $1.5 million, a $1.3 million difference, and I can say that that's primarily made up of the Crystal Lagoon fees, which have not been received yet as anticipated. The member assessments are quite a bit higher than where we expected to be at this point. On the other hand, the builder assessments are somewhat lower. So those two tend to balance each other out. There's about a $200,000 surplus between those two. So really not concerned too much, because again, they sort of balance each other out. And also, even though it's a pretty big number of $1.3 million that we're short on the Crystal Lagoon fees, it's not a concern at this point, because we anticipate receiving those before the end of the year. But also, if you recall the budget presentation last year, we were looking at about a $1.5 million surplus for the year. So all told, we have the cash that we need to operate the association. We're in a fair position and do anticipate receiving those funds before the end of the year. Continuing on and moving over to the expenses, we'll start with the administrative and general category. And this is a category where you'll find things like the event expenses, the staff and salaries, and office supplies and things of that nature. This one we were anticipating being somewhere around 1.1 million, and as you can see here, it's very close. We're actually about 1.07 million, so very, very close, about $30,000 off year to date. So you can see we've got quite a bit of funds allocated for the remainder of the year, and we're pretty close to where we should be at this point in the year. So moving on to contract services, and you can see here with the dollar amount, that's our biggest category. For the year, contract services was budgeted. You can see that's the bottom line there on the graph. Contract services is about a $3 million budget for us. We are expected to be around 2.6 for the year, and just a shade over, as you can see there with the top bar, we're at about 2.9. And I can tell you that the largest surplus in that category is with the additional plantings, or what we call landscape extras or landscape additional. We're about 147,000 over where we expected to be. And many of you saw the work being done in early fall. There's a lot of landscape improvements that were done, right when it started to cool off out of summer. So that pushed us over. But again, with that surplus I talked about earlier, we're still in a good position, and we felt it was important to move forward with those improvements. Other categories in that department there are doing okay. We, in terms of contract landscaping, we're a little over on that one too. But as things fell with the October financial report, we actually had an extra month show up here, so that'll even out during November and December months. So we're okay in that category. Have some large surpluses, one being in the pool monitor category. So we are overall okay in this category, and again, with funds remaining for the year, we should end up just fine here. Moving on to repair and maintenance. This is a relatively small dollar amount category. Not to say they won't spend a lot of time here, but as you can see, it's very close to where we projected being at this point in the year. So for repair and maintenance, we were expecting to be at 164.8, and we're at 165.2. So just a few $100 over the anticipated budget at this point in the year. And the primary driver there had a couple of categories, but it was mainly irrigation repairs. With the drought earlier this year, we had a lot of soil issues and cracking and drying and moving, and the underground pipes don't tend to like that. So we had a lot of breaks, a lot of repairs along the way, and the other one was what we'll call the miscellaneous repair category, and several repairs projects over the year that pushed us just a little bit above on that category. But as you can see, overall, we're very close to where we thought we'd be. Next is the parts and supplies, and again, a small dollar amount, but there are some large percentage overages, primarily with the lighting and electrical repair category. The parts and supplies there, the light bulbs and light fixtures, have pushed us quite a bit over. With the commons, a lot of the fixtures and lights are starting to show their age. They're about 7-8 years old and being replaced now. We noticed a couple things where in some cases the light bulbs were discontinued from many years ago, so rather than replace one, we had to go with all new ones to swap them out. So we're seeing that here. And then as we move on to utilities, this is one where we had some very large deficits here, some overages on the expense categories, primarily with water. No surprise to anybody here with the drought we had this year and the extra water that we had to put down. And I think what this is, if we take a step back and if we're being honest, I think I might have been a little aggressive last year when it comes to the budget, because we had talked about moving from domestic water to well water in a lot of these areas that we maintain. So there might have been a little bit too much optimism in terms of how much we would save. So when we're talking about deficits to budget, if the budget was a little bit too aggressive, that's why we're going to see that deficit there. And then the other thing is we had some new areas that came online that were immediately switched on to domestic water that have not yet been able to be switched to well water. So when we had the drought and the extra usage there, we didn't have the opportunity for savings. So I see all that evening out in the coming year, especially after we switch these newer areas in the phases to the north over to Wellwater. But this year, this was a category that hurt us. And we also had an overage in electric service here. So it's a combination of those two that pushed us over. And as you can see, we've already exceeded the 2022 budget for utilities with 2 months left to go. So we will end up in a deficit in this category. In insurance, we're also over. This isn't quite as big of a concern because some of this might be payment timing issues where when we got the new policy, there was a large upfront payment and then several other payments throughout the year on our payment plan that we were on with the insurance carriers. So a lot of this will even out. Some of it, the costs came in a bit higher than we projected, but overall, I think this is primarily going to be a payment timing issue here. As you can see, we're close to the annual budget, and we might be finished with the payments for this policy period. And so that brings us to the end of the review, and you can see the year-to-date totals for the expense side, where we are right around 4.9, just under $5 million, and the budget year-to-date was 4.4. So you can see that's about a $600,000 difference. The year-to-date, excuse me, the budget for the year is $5.2 million. So we still have some room there with a few months to go. And as I mentioned, with the surplus in revenue, we're not concerned from a cash position how we're going to end up. So that brings us into the budget discussion. And just like before with the financial review, we're going to start here with the income side and the revenue. So for the board, as I present the numbers here for you, they're in no particular order here to the right, but on the left-hand side, we'll all see the pie chart that shows the different percentages. So I'll kind of run through the numbers here, starting with member assessments or the individual assessments that residents pay. The budget projection for next year is $3,037,914, and that's followed by the builder assessments. So the quarterly fee that the builders pay on their lots is $1,600,017,715. Next, and actually the largest category once again, is the builder Crystal Lagoon fee, and that's at $3,410,000. That's followed by the category we call rental income. And I didn't go into a lot of detail here in the financial recap, but what rental income is this really a lagoon category. So if you're renting boats or the kayaks or the stand-up paddleboards, that rental income that we receive goes here. And also the guest access day pass fees that we collect also go into this income category. So that we're budgeting at $37,500 for next year. And that's followed by the event income category. So for our events, we have sponsorship that's generated that revenue, as well as ticket fees, we'll call them. So think the farm to table dinner, where there was a per person fee, and several other events that are like that, where there is a fee to enter, a fee to be involved. We're estimating and projecting that revenue next year to be $98,250. And then lastly, the working capital contribution, which is a fee collected at escrow, that is projected to be $175,224. And so you can see over here on the left, as I mentioned earlier, the largest category, once again, it was similarly this sized in terms of the pie chart here, is the builder Crystal Lagoon fees. Next year it's going to be a little over 40% of our total revenue. The next category is the member assessments, followed by the builder assessments, and then the others that we talked about before. So really the plurality, we'll say, not the actual majority, but most of the fees individually will come from the Crystal Lagoon fee, followed by about 40% combined between member assessments and builder assessments. So that's the income projection for next year. Now going into the expenses, And again, this is really in no particular order in relation to the pie chart there next to you, but the administrative and general, that category we talked about with events and staffing. And in terms of staffing, we presented a staffing plan to the board. There may be some additional hiring next year as the community grows and continues to build out and our responsibilities increase. So that plan was presented to the board. This will add funding to carry that out should the board decide to continue with that. And that's estimated at $1,601,945. Let's see, one thing I want to talk about also the events. We added some funding. It's about a 13% overall increase in the events budget. We plan to do a lot of the same events we did this year. Jed and his team may add a few to the calendar, but we'll also go on a bit larger scale on some of the events with the community growing and getting larger. On contract services side, that continues to be our largest category. And again, that's for things like the lagoon maintenance, landscape maintenance, the pool monitors, the janitorial service, porter service. In several of those categories I just mentioned, porter, janitorial, there are going to be some others along the way I mentioned. We're also anticipating the third amenity center to come online late next year. So, similarly to what we have at the Commons, the services that are in place, the janitorial service, the air conditioning maintenance, the fire alarm service, all those services will also be in place at the third amenity center. So for that category, the projection is $3,406,224. Next on this list here is the repairs and maintenance category. There's an increase here, and I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment, but the number is $365,800. And you can see the repair and maintenance is about 5% of the overall budget. We're adding some funds there. We had some unforeseen expenses this year. For example, we had some concrete repairs that were just approved that we'll be executing here over the next couple months. That was not a budgeted expense. So we added some funds here for some of those projects. If something should happen next year, the funding will be there. Next, we've got parts and supplies, and that comes in at $124,988. Similarly, we're adding some funds for additional parts and repair items for the Commons as the building and the amenity center continues to age, and we're continuing with repairs. We're going to make sure the funding is there for that. Insurance will increase somewhat to $130,536. We just renewed policies in November, so we have a pretty good idea what the figures should be for the next year on that one. Did see some slight increases in a few categories, but overall that's not too much, not as much as we thought it might be. So insurance came in at $130,536. Next, and we're going to put this on the pie chart here. I don't believe it was on there last year, but the reserve funding, I want to show everyone here. Overall, as a percentage, it's not a real large chunk of Windsong Ranch, but the number is something I want to highlight. And it's increasing about 16% to $600,000 for next year. So that's the we'll call it the savings account transfer, that the funds transfer that we're going to make to fund future repairs of major items in the community. And we're going to talk a lot about reserve studies and reserve funding tonight. So we're going to start here by mentioning that next year the funding will be $600,000, and there'll be a lot more covered on some upcoming slides. And then lastly, the capital expense item, which as you can see is a very, very small, actually smallest category here, but there's $120,000 in funds set aside for some projects that we have in mind next year and a couple of purchases. So one of the purchases, for example, is we're looking at an additional light duty utility vehicle for the porter service and the crew that drive the trails to do cleanup along the trails. We've already taken several miles of additional trails this year, with many more to come. So this will give them an additional resource to use while they're out there. And we've also got a couple of other projects we're working on. Nothing I want to give away just yet, but we're excited about the possibilities, and this will allow funding should we decide to move forward. So on this next slide here, we're looking at some what I'll call change factors. So this budget, and I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody when I say that Giovanna and I put a lot of time into the budget. It's a very detailed and involved process, so I want to share with you some of the things that we considered when putting this in place and preparing this draft for the board's consideration. So first, on the income side, the owner and builder assessments, with the growth of the community, the new lots that the developer is selling to builders are selling to new residents, that's going to generate almost $1 million next year. It's an extra $902,000. So that trend, that's going to continue on for the next several years as we move forward. But next year, that's going to be just over $900,000 added year over year. The builder Crystal Lagoon fees, which I talked a fair amount about, and there's going to be a bit more here in just a moment. But the builder Crystal Lagoon fees is an added source of revenue. I mentioned it that way because it started about 2 years ago when the board created this fee to builders that generates revenue to the association. We're projecting it to be about $3.4 million next year. And as I mentioned, it started about 2 years ago, and it was, I want to say, about $300,000 in 2020, about $1.5 million in 2021, and close to $3 million budgeted for this year. So next year, we're looking at about $3.4 million. Also, and this is an important note, no subsidy contributions from the developer. We will continue, and I put it that way, and I'll get into that more here. We have a slide coming up on the promissory note itself, which we talked about the promissory note at a couple of meetings last year, including this one last year with the developer promissory note. We are estimating making that first payment this year, and then we will continue to pay down the promissory note. On the expense side, a couple of things to talk about here. Under contract services, I mentioned landscape maintenance and improvements was one that pushed us over as far as year to date this year. We're increasing the additional landscape for next year. Part of the reason was the board has already approved projects and extra work. That's going to happen in the spring of next year. So we're making sure the funding is there. We're also adding some funds for tree maintenance and tree removals in some cases in the open space areas where we've lost trees. I mentioned the staffing plan earlier, and something that's new in 2023 is that we are adding some funding, and it's not a large amount, but we're adding some funding for patrol service. And so, as many of you know, if you've been to an event, Wine and Music Festival comes to mind, the Star Spangled Bash, we had Prosper PD uniformed officers at our events. So those were off-duty officers that we hired to be stationed at our events. So we already have an account with the off-duty service, and we're adding funding in here to allow for additional traffic enforcement. So that will help to augment the services already in place from Prosper PD. We're adding funding so there can be some additional patrols if we decide to bring those out. And again, we already have the account with them, so this will add some funding should we want to bring out Prosper PD for additional patrols for traffic enforcement. Next is the repair and maintenance and parts and supplies categories. And I mentioned earlier that with the third amenity center coming online in probably the fourth quarter of next year, we're adding funding for things like air conditioning maintenance and fire alarm servicing and electric service and just general repairs that'll fall into this category, and also the next one I've got here on the page for utilities. We are increasing the common areas that we're responsible for. We're also bringing on the third amenity center. So several of these on this list up here, contract services, repair and maintenance, utilities, these also include funding for the third amenity center. And we're planning a similar expense set as we see at the Commons. So again, building maintenance, building repairs, janitorial services, on and on and on. We anticipate those to be at the bridge as well. And then lastly on this list, reserve funding. I mentioned earlier the 16% increase in long-term capital repair funding. The main thing is, and when the developer turns the association over to the residents, and we can see the horizon, we know that that day is not too far off, and I know it is very, very important to them that they leave the association in a good, strong financial position. So this funding plan, this budget, will help to continue that trend of funding reserves and helping us to avoid any risk of special assessments. So with that, the proposed budget for 2023 does not call for a change in the assessment rate. So the monthly assessments will remain at $147 per month. That's of course billed quarterly at $441. Again, no change from the rate in 2022. And as I mentioned earlier, it increases the funding plan here, increases the funding for repairs, landscape projects, the third amenity center, capital projects that we discussed earlier, and reserve funding at the existing rate. And we had in mind that there was an increase in assessments in 2022, bringing the rate from 134 to 147. So not to say that there won't be assessment increases in the future, or we shouldn't anticipate them with inflation and other increases that we see, but we are confident that we can continue to provide the level of services that we have at the same rate. So kind of moving on and talking about the developer promissory note, as I mentioned, we're going to get into some detail here. The promissory note was executed in November, in 2020 in November, and it documents all of the subsidy payments received by the developer. The payments are to Windsong Ranch, and so from inception, that number was about $7.6 million. It's up here, $7.619 million. The current balance of the promissory note is $4.144,652.15 for anybody writing that down. So it's just over $4 million. And if you're looking at the two numbers, there's a delta. There's a difference between the two of about $3.5 million. Those funds were, we'll say, forgiven by the developer, written down, not expected to be repaid. We haven't made the first promissory note payment yet, so that balance of $4.1 million is what we started with essentially earlier this year. We do anticipate making the first payment later this year. I mentioned earlier about the Crystal Lagoon fee receipts being a little bit under what we expected. We've had some great dialogue with the board. The development team, they understand the schedule of the Crystal Lagoon fees to the association. There's been no pressure to make that first payment. The understanding is that it will be made later this year as we receive additional Crystal Lagoon fees as expected. So talking about those fees, it is a fee assessed by the developer to the builders when they purchase a lot. So that fee between those two organizations, the development and the builders, is payable to the association. So the developer created a fee that will fund the association. Doesn't go to the developer through the association, it's directly to the association. That fee so far has generated almost $3 million to the association. So as I mentioned earlier, it has helped us to fund the operation, help us to get off of the subsidy payments from the developer. We've used those funds for operating expenses so far. The total Builder Crystal Lagoon fees that we anticipate receiving when it's all said and done, so this is again over the next couple of years, will be about $7.6 million. So looking at what we've received versus what's paid out, we anticipate, and I've got a little typo there I'll fix, we've got about $3-4 million that's still to come. So all that to say that we will be retiring the promissory note and using that to fund reserves without any implication on the member assessments. So that's an important point. I want to highlight, illustrate, underline that I mentioned earlier about the member assessments going up over time. That's the income that we're seeing, not the actual rate. So as more members come into the association, that's going to help to build up our member assessments. But in the meantime, we're using the Builder Crystal Lagoon fees to both offset the operating expenses to avoid increases to the members, but also to pay down the promissory note. And then finally, I want to talk about the reserve funding because it's a very important component of our financial health and strength. So what I've got on screen for everyone here is a snapshot between where we started this year and where we will be at the beginning of next year. And so this will be sent out for everyone, but it shows that at the beginning of this year, and if you look over here, and I think I may have a pointer here, depending on our lighting, we started off in that red weak financial strength area, and what they consider, and I say they, this is prepared by our independent third-party reserve analyst. And they put us in the high risk of special assessment starting off this year. So we were at 30.1%, so actually technically just a hair over 30%, which puts us into that yellow area. But we were considered at a high risk of special assessment in the considered weak financial strength. Now, after funding, and again, this is year to date, so we funded $430,000 into the reserve fund as of October. By the end of the year, that'll be increased by the $86,000 for the next 2 months. At the beginning of next year, so if you'll bring your attention to the red arrows, where we started this year and where we will start next year is the difference between our reserve funding from year over year. So we're going to start next year with just over $1 million in the reserve fund, and that will put us at 38.8%. So that's a pretty good improvement from one year to the next. And that puts us in the fair strength of that yellow category. Puts us well into that category. And also the risk of special assessment moves from high to medium. So very much on the right track. And as I mentioned here, and this is according to our reserve analyst, 30% of all community associations are in that weak and high risk category. So we're now inching towards that healthy marker. The target is the green area. So the target, I say here, is over 70%. But if we're being honest, I think it goes without saying our target is 100%. But what I don't want to do is have anybody here, including the board or any future board members, get so focused on that 100% number that they fund reserves at the detriment of other things. We still plan to provide all the services that we do while striving to get into that green area. So that's 70 to 100%. So again, happy to say that with the funding for this year and with next year's budget, if approved, we'll be putting in another $600,000 into the Windsong Ranch reserve account. And that's it for me for now. I'll come back up and happy to take questions after our meeting, but let's let Giovanna give the Villas presentation, and then we'll hear from the board.
Well, hey, Villas. I'm Giovanna, Operations Director here at Windsong. So I'm going to take a stab at this budget for the Villas. So for the 2022 financial review, the Villas and Townhomes revenue. So year to date, Our budget was $535,296, and right now we are at $573,822.90. So we have a $38,526 surplus um, for our revenue as of October. Our expenses on the expense side, contract services.
Surplus. It's good.
Contract services, we budgeted for 201,254, and we have actual of 217,883. So that leaves us in a deficit of 16,629.50. And our contract services has two components. It has the our contracts and our additional. So our contracts would be our landscapers, WSR Grounds, who is now our landscaping company, and then we have our additionals, which would be like plantings, irrigation, things like repair, things like that. So that's where we are on our expenses for contracts. For repair and maintenance, we budgeted for $32,250, and we are at $45,223. We are over roughly around $13,000. Our repair and maintenance includes irrigation repairs and general maintenance. And so we know irrigation has been an issue in the villas with the overage of water. And so we have transferred over to WSR Grounds, which we are hoping that the irrigation issue will get resolved with some things, projects that we're doing with the irrigation audit, have them coming through and make sure irrigation is correct before we do any more planting in the villas. And so we are expecting that to get better into 2023. Parts and supplies, we budgeted for $3,000, and we haven't spent much, maybe $191 in parts and supplies. And parts and supplies are things like paint and wood we may need for pergolas and things like that in the villas. Utilities. I know this is a big one for the villas. For utilities, we budgeted for $24,200, and we have spent $83,588 with an overage of around $59,388. Utilities is our electricity and then our water. So the electricity is for our controllers in the villas for irrigation, and then of course watering the common area and the plants for your landscaping in the villas. Water has been an issue, as you've seen on the Windsong side as well, with the drought over the summer, with the major irrigation repairs that we had to do due to breaks, main leaks, things like that we had to do. And then it's just being hot. We had to water more than usual this summer. So we are quite a bit over for utilities. Insurance. So with insurance, we budgeted for $153,810, and actual right now we're at $179,244. And I think we're just a little bit ahead on our insurance. We've made an extra payment. We renewed our policy in April. We put a 25% down, and then we are paying that over time. So that should even out through the end of the year. We're probably one or two payments ahead for our insurance. So, and our expenses total for the villas is budgeted for $414,514, And right now we're at 526,132, which leaves us an overage of 111,618 for our expenses. And I know, so when we talk about the overage, that the little surplus that we have, I know a lot of you might be asking about the staining and, you know, things that we plan to do this year. That may still get done, but we understand it's important to do the maintenance for your pergolas and repainting and things like that. But with the overage for the utilities and irrigation, that kind of takes away from that general maintenance. So what we have in that pot, we're going to carry over to 2023 and add to that so that we can make sure we get to those things as like the pergola and painting and things that need to be done for the maintenance in the villa. So I just want you to know that that's not lost. It's not on the back burner, but we do plan to get that done. So the 2023 budget income is as follows. For the service area assessments, we have 855,096. Builder assessments, we don't expect anything from the builder assessment. Grenadier builds pretty quickly, and so we usually don't get anything from the builder assessment because as soon as they build, they sell the lot. The working capital contribution, 49,200. That's at escrow. That's 4 times the assessment, which is usually at closing that we receive. So this is our 2023 budget expense. For our contract services, we have 297,754. For repairs and maintenance, 87,300. Parts and supplies, 2,400. Utilities, 57,820. Insurance, 257,441, and reserve funding, 201,600. So you will see the pie charts a little different than previous years. Previous years we did have insurance as was a little bit higher in percentage. It has come down some with the new policy. And also we did put reserve funding on this slide, even though it's not an expense, it's a transfer. We did put it on there because we want you to see what we're budgeting for reserve funding. We know how important it is to do the reserve funding. Want to make sure that you know that we have sat down, went over this budget, and made sure that we are focusing on reserves for 2023 as well. Contract services has went up a little bit. We do have a new contract, landscaping company, as I mentioned, WSR Grounds. They are actually less expensive. The reason that the percentage is a little higher is because we budgeted for oncoming homes that come online. So as we get more homes, then, you know, it'll be a little bit more for them to maintain those as well. So the 2023, some change factors, owner assessments, growth of the villas and anticipated new homes included in total, 237,000 added year over year. So as you saw the pie with all the pieces and percentages, and I know you, some of the villa residents that's been here a long time, you know, it's not fair to, if it's just only 150 of you and you have to divide that pie between the 150 of you. So as we get more residents in the villas and townhomes, then that pie will lessen and you won't have so much burden to pay. So the growth of the villas is anticipated, and the total is the 237 added year over year. For building assessments, begin at completion of building, so the sale to the first owner, and no revenue is projected in 2023. Working capital, fee due upon transfer, it's increased by 9,000 at 22%. Expenses, landscape contract increases as new buildings are added. So as I said, as we get more buildings, then we have to budget for the maintenance for those buildings as well. Additional landscaping increased by 1%. You might ask, why just 1%? When we sat down and did the budget, we understand that some of you have been here and you've witnessed or had to deal with us increasing assessments for the last 2 years. So me and Bob sat down when we did this budget, and our goal was trying not to increase assessments. We sat down and see where we could, what we could do to not increase the assessments, and landscaping was where we just did a slight increase, where we budgeted so that when we're for next year's budget that we don't go up too much, because it was a thin line. It could went in either way, but we wanted to find a good balance that we can try and keep the villas going with what we had and not increase it too much. We are doing some things to help villas and the maintenance of it. As I mentioned, we did switch over landscaping companies from Woodlake to WSR Grounds. WSR Grounds has shown statistically to be cheaper than Woodlake, and also we are bringing in a independent contractor or specialist, you would say, for doing our irrigation, doing an audit, going around the villas to make sure that irrigation is correct and that we can fix any issues that we have, because we have seen that irrigation is the biggest issue in the villas, and we want to make sure we touch base on that first. Have them come in along with WSR Grounds, fix what needs to be repaired, if we need to add more sprinkler heads or we need to add more drip lines, whatever the case may be, so that when we do plant in the spring, that the plants won't die and that they will continue to thrive, and we won't have the issues that we've had over the last couple of years. Repairs and maintenance, 214% in irrigation repairs increase, and as I just discussed, we do have an independent specialist coming in to help us with our irrigation issues in the villas, and 79% building maintenance repair increase. The building maintenance, as I mentioned, painting that needs to do for some of the pergolas and staining and things like that, we will take what we have in this budget and transfer it over to 2023 and add to it as well, so that we can make sure we get that done. Insurance increases as new buildings are added, so 40% higher than 2022. Water service, landscape irrigation increase of 134%. Efficiency improvements expected in 2023. So as I said, WSR Grounds does an awesome job in Windsong, and so we're glad to have them in the villas, and we don't doubt that they will do a great job as far as maintaining the villas, maintaining landscaping, and being more efficient with the water usage. We had to have difficult conversations with Woodlake in regards to the maintenance and managing of the water systems in the villas, just not at its best. So we brought WSR Grounds in, and we are confident that they will do better job as far as the managing of the water systems, irrigation in the villas. Reserve funding, 12% increased in line with recommendation in the 2023 reserve study. So 12% increase, and that's based on our independent reserve study specialist who gave us recommendations for your reserves. So for the 2023 budget for the villas and townhomes, the rate, there will be no increase in your rate. $246 per month will remain for 2023. Like I discussed, said earlier, me and Bob sat down and really went through the budget. We know some of you are retired. We understand that some of you, are on a fixed income, and we really did not want to raise assessments. We're empathetic to you residents in the villas, and we know that you had 2 increases year over year, and so we did our best to keep what we had, and we're going to do our best to try to service you as best as we can with what we have on this 2023 budget. We're happy that we did not have to increase your assessments. It actually could have went either way, but we decided to go with the latter and stay with the amount that we have now, and we are confident that we will maintain and service you with the budget that we have right now. Those increased funding for irrigation repairs, general maintenance, and water reserve funding. So as I talked about irrigation, that's a big one on our list, to make sure that your irrigation is working properly so that we don't have issues like we had this year with utilities and things like that. And we also, it is important that we reserve your funding. We fund reserves for 2023 as well. Previous assessment increase, 205 to 246 per month in 2022. And like I said, we will stay with the 246 per month. Reserve funding for the villas. So the 2022 funding is $30,000 plus the $78,433.69 that we got caught up for 2021. So if you remember, we were not yet fully funded for 2021, and we had done that, and that was the $78,433.69. So if you see at the top where it says starting reserve balance, that is what we started with in 2022, 103,411, and we project to start in January of 2023, 211,546. Reserve funding strength is at 18.3%. So that is considered to be weak, and we're at risk for a special assessment. However, even with that, we are still, for 2023, our baseline funding. So they gave us 2 options. You can have a baseline funding and you can full fund. Well, you can see our expenses. We can't full fund, but we can baseline fund, which is going to be for 2023, the $16,800. And basically the baseline funding is we will always have money in our reserves. So that's what baseline funding is. We'll always have money there for in case something happens and we need to get money and have money there. It doesn't increase like if we were full funding where we go up and up. It's just at a level right now until we are able to fund more. But in 2023, we are funding $6,800 a month. That is our goal, with a reserve fund strength of 23.8%. We're still in the red, but as you see over time, we will get closer and closer, and we will build and then try to get out of that weak strength and get stronger as we go year over year. So the villas planning ahead. So our contract landscape service transition, as I discussed, we transitioned to WSR grounds October 1st. Irrigation mapping repair proposals approved. So our irrigation audits and repair proposal has been approved. So we will have our specialists come in to do irrigation audits for the villas so that we can get you all set up for hopefully spring plantings. Impacts to additional landscape water reserve funding increased from $180,000 to $201,000. So $180,000 is what we did this year, and then we will go up to $201,000. 108 was fully funded. 108 was funded in 2022. Just the villas unit count at the beginning of 2021, we were at 130, and in 2022, 234, and then we look to be built out in 2023 at 312 units. So the pieces of the pie, the burden will be reduced because we will be fully built out, and that big old pie that we saw will be equally divided amongst all 312 residents. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Giovanna. How about a round of applause for Giovanna? Very detailed presentation. Thank you very much. So with that presentation to the board, at this time, I would like to ask for a motion to approve the budget as presented. All right, thank you. Craig Martin motions. Is there a second?
Tina second.
Tina beat you to it. Before the vote, is there any discussion amongst the board about the presentation, budget numbers, before we vote?
I think so. I think it's pretty thorough. Appreciate the detail. It's good.
Thank you.
Good that we didn't have to raise dues.
Well, as Giovanna said, it really, especially on the villa side, there could have been an equally good argument either way, especially on the landscape replacements. I know the residents want that done yesterday, so we could have very easily added 200,000 to just do it all in 2023. That the pieces of pie are still kind of big, so that would have meant a big increase to everyone next year. So we plan to use what's a respectable amount. It's about the $67,000 landscape extra budget. That's a respectable amount, and like Giovanna said, we're confident in Corey and Brock and the WSR crew that they'll come in and use that wisely, and we'll get a lot done next year with what we've planned.
So if that level of service improving, not raising the dues rate, and then improving the reserve position, that's a pretty good position for 2023.
Yes, sir.
I'm really happy with that.
Thank you. All right, so we have a motion and a second from the board. All in favor of approving the 2023 budget? All right, it is unanimous. And with that being the only item on the agenda, we can entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
David? Craig? All in favor? All right, thank you, folks. Before we go,